Most potted plants die if the soil stays completely soaked. But today, we're intentionally flooding a plastic tub to recreate a prehistoric peat bog right on a windowsill, and filling it with flesh-eating Sarracenia pitcher plants. That's Sarracenia. And by the end of this video, you'll be saying it constantly. Quick question before we get into it. Have you ever grown a carnivorous plant before? Or would this be your very first one? Let me know in the comments below. This is everything you need to know to build a miniature bog container micro-ecosystem at home, why it works, and why it breaks almost every rule you've ever learned about container gardening. So why would anyone want a bog on their windowsill? The answer goes back about 70 million years to the late Cretaceous period, when flowering plants were diversifying rapidly across the planet, and a strange evolutionary experiment was just getting started. In sunny, waterlogged, acidic wetlands, where the soil contained almost no nitrogen or phosphorus, certain plants faced a brutal choice: adapt or die. The soil couldn't feed them, so they learned to feed themselves. They evolved traps, sticky surfaces, pitfall chambers, snap jaws. Over millions of years, carnivorous traits evolved independently in different plant families at least 6 separate times. Today, there are roughly 800 known carnivorous species on Earth, and the pitcher plant, genus Sarracenia, is one of the most spectacular. First, the history. Sarracenia are native to the bogs of eastern North America. They grow tall, elegant, trumpet-shaped leaves that function as elaborate death traps, with bright colors and inviting scents that lure insects in. Visitors get forced into perilous positions by waxy surfaces or tricked by transparent patches in the leaves that confuse them like false windows. Nectar laced with a mild toxin intoxicates them, and those who slip and tumble down the pitcher get trapped by dense mats of downward-pointing hairs, then digested by the plant's own enzymes, or in some species, by a symbiotic community of microorganisms living in the trap fluid. The prey breaks down into amino acids, peptides, phosphates, ammonium, and urea, and from that solution, the plant extracts the nitrogen and phosphorus that the soil could never provide. Sarracenia belongs to the family Sarraceniaceae, which also includes 2 remarkable sister genera. Darlingtonia californica, the cobra lily, grows in cold mountain seeps of California and Oregon, its hooded pitchers twisting like a striking snake. And Heliamphora, the sun pitchers of South America, are considered the most primitive pitcher plants alive, growing at altitude on the ancient Tepuy plateaus of Venezuela. Together, Sarracenia, Darlingtonia, and Heliamphora form the entire Sarraceniaceae family, a tight taxonomic cluster that tells a fascinating story about how pitcher trap architecture evolved in the Americas. Charles Darwin was absolutely captivated by these plants. As early as 1859, the same year he published On the Origin of Species, he encountered a sundew on an English heath and wrote, "I care more about Drosera than the origin of all the species in the world." By 1860, he was experimenting with Venus flytraps, and he corresponded extensively with Mary Treat, a New Jersey naturalist and one of the foremost field naturalists of her era, who was the first to document live insect digestion behavior in pitcher plants through direct observation. Darwin and Treat exchanged 15 letters between 1871 and 1876 about carnivorous plant behavior, and Darwin wrote to her more than to any other female naturalist of his era. His rigorous experimentation culminated in 1875 with the publication of Insectivorous Plants, a landmark work that laid the foundation for everything we know about these organisms today. He called the Venus flytrap one of the most wonderful plants in the world. These are ancient, deeply fascinating organisms with a 70-million-year evolutionary heritage. And here's the remarkable thing: you can grow them on your windowsill. You just have to give them the one thing they need, which happens to be the one thing every gardening book tells you never to create: a bog. Now, the science. A peat bog isn't just wet dirt. It's a very specific type of wetland defined by the accumulation of peat, which is partially decomposed organic matter. Unlike fens or marshes, bogs receive water and nutrients primarily from precipitation rather than groundwater or surface runoff. That isolation makes them extraordinarily nutrient-poor, with water that runs extremely acidic, typically between pH 3.0 and 4.5. Below the surface, the waterlogged environment is almost completely anaerobic, meaning oxygen is largely absent. Widespread peat bog formation in the northern hemisphere began after glaciers retreated around 12,000 years ago, which means the ecosystem we're replicating on a windowsill is itself a remnant of the last ice age. The key material that makes a bog is sphagnum moss, and this stuff is an engineering marvel. Sphagnum contains large, dead, empty cells called hyaline cells that can absorb and hold up to 20 times the moss's dry weight in water. 20 times. That's not a typo. And it does something even more remarkable on the chemical side. The moss actively exchanges cations like calcium and magnesium for hydrogen ions, naturally driving the surrounding water's pH into that acidic range of 3.0 to 4.5. Sphagnum doesn't just hold water, it manufactures acidity. It creates the bog, and that is exactly what we're going to exploit. Quick pause before we start building. Out of everything we've covered so far, what surprised you the most about how bogs actually work? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. Now let's build this thing. Here's where we start breaking the rules of container gardening. Rule number 1 in every potting guide ever written: always ensure proper drainage. Drainage holes prevent root rot, let excess water escape, and are generally treated as sacred. We're throwing that rule out the window. The only real requirement for a mini bog is finding a container made of plastic or metal that has no drainage holes and holds moisture without letting it escape. Almost anything works: a window box, a deep plastic tub, a salad bowl, an old toolbox. Some people even use rain boots. You need at least 6 to 8 inches of depth for smaller species. For larger Sarracenia, aim for 12 to 16 inches, because these plants develop extensive root systems. In terms of USDA hardiness zones, Sarracenia are reliably hardy in zones 5 through 9, which gives you a sense of how much cold tolerance they actually have. Relevant if you're planning to grow outdoors or on an exposed porch. This is what makes bog container micro-ecosystems such an interesting corner of container gardening. You're deliberately creating what every other potted plant would consider a death sentence: permanent saturation with zero drainage. Rule number 2 we're breaking: feed your plants fertilizer. Don't fertilize carnivorous plants, ever. They extract all the nutrients they need from insects, and standard potting mixes contain fertilizer and organic nutrients that will burn carnivorous roots on contact. This is one of the most common mistakes beginners make. Only use sphagnum peat and perlite, or clean horticultural sand, with zero additives. Rule number 3: use tap water. Your tap water very likely contains too many dissolved solids, minerals, and salts to keep a Sarracenia alive, and it can kill them within weeks. Unless you live somewhere like New York City, where tap water measures less than 100 parts per million in dissolved solids with a pH below 8, stick to distilled water, reverse osmosis water, or collected rainwater. If your tap measures below 50 parts per million, you might get away with it, but distilled water from the grocery store is the safest bet for most people. The dissolved minerals and chlorine in standard tap water accumulate in the soil over time and burn the roots. Even filtered water from a standard kitchen faucet cartridge typically leaves enough minerals to cause damage within a few months. For soil, you're making a mix of sphagnum peat moss and either perlite or lime-free horticultural sand. The traditional ratio is about 2 parts peat to 1 part perlite or sand. Some growers prefer a slightly more complex recipe: 50% sphagnum peat moss, 30% horticultural sand, and 20% long fiber sphagnum moss. Either approach works well. A handful of horticultural charcoal mixed in can help with odor control over time, though it's not strictly necessary. Here's the process. Mix your peat and perlite together dry, then saturate the mix with distilled water until it reaches a mud-like consistency. This takes more water than you'd expect, because dry peat is actually hydrophobic and repels water at first. You may need to knead it with your hands for several minutes until it's fully saturated. Pack the wet mix into your container, filling it up, then plant your Sarracenia directly into the mix. If you have live sphagnum moss, lay it on top as a living mulch. It looks beautiful, helps retain moisture, and over time, it grows and further acidifies the environment. Once everything's planted, fill the container with distilled water all the way to the top of the soil. The soil should always be wet, not damp, not moist, wet, saturated, boggy. You're simulating a peat bog, and in a peat bog, the water table sits right at or just below the surface. Placement is critical, and it's honestly the biggest challenge for indoor growers. Sarracenias require at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight daily. Not bright, indirect light, not near a window, but direct, unobstructed sunlight hitting the leaves. A south-facing windowsill is ideal for indoor cultivation. If natural light isn't sufficient, grow lights supplementing a photo period of 12 to 16 hours will do the job. And honestly, it is hard to give the taller pitcher plants all the light they need indoors. Terrariums are generally unsuitable for adult plants because light intensity inside them falls short. A very bright south-facing window can absolutely work, but managing expectations matters here. That's why species selection is so important. If you're committed to a windowsill setup, choose a smaller species like Sarracenia purpurea, the purple pitcher plant, or a compact hybrid involving it. Sarracenia purpurea grows low, rosette-shaped pitchers that stay relatively small and handle slightly lower light conditions better than the tall, erect species. Compare that to Sarracenia leucophylla, the white-topped pitcher, which can reach almost a meter tall. That's a magnificent plant, but it's going to struggle on a windowsill. Good windowsill choices include Sarracenia purpurea, hybrids like Sarracenia Judith Hindle or Conversation Piece, and if you have the space, Sarracenia Brooks hybrid. You can source these from reputable nurseries like California Carnivores in the US or Hampshire Carnivorous Plants in the UK. California Carnivores ships a wide range of pitcher plants throughout the United States, along with ideal companion plants like Venus flytraps, sundews, and butterworts, pinguicula, which thrive in the exact same bog conditions and round out a genuinely diverse carnivorous plant collection in a single container. And that's one of the great pleasures of a mini bog. You're not limited to a single species. Venus flytraps, sundews, butterworts, and pitcher plants all evolved in acidic, nutrient-poor, waterlogged habitats. They all want the same soil, the same water, the same screaming bright light, which means you can build a genuine miniature ecosystem in one container. Peter D'Amato, author of The Savage Garden, widely considered the single best book on carnivorous plants you can buy, has been advocating for exactly this kind of accessible home growing for decades. Ron Detterman, at the Atlanta Botanical Garden, designed and perfected the bog building technique that many of today's guides are based on. There's one more thing we need to talk about, and it's the thing most people forget: dormancy. Sarracenias are temperate plants, and in the wild, across their native USDA zones 5 through 9 range, they experience cold winters. They require 3 to 5 months of winter dormancy with reduced temperatures and a shorter photo period. During that period, you want to keep them cool, ideally between 35 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and while dormant, they can actually withstand episodes of overnight frost down to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're growing on a windowsill, an unheated garage, a cold porch, or even pushing the container against the coldest window in your house during winter can work. The pitchers will die back. The plant will look dead. It's not. It's sleeping. When spring arrives, it sends up fresh, vibrant pitchers that are even more impressive than the year before. Skip dormancy, and the plant weakens over successive growing seasons until it dies. It's not optional. The sustainability question is worth raising too, because it's a real one. Peat harvesting damages peatlands, which are enormous carbon sinks. Peat bogs store roughly 2 times as much carbon as all the world's forests combined. That's estimated at around 30% of all terrestrial carbon on Earth, despite covering only 3% of the land surface. And extracting peat for horticulture releases greenhouse gases. If this concerns you, and it probably should, look for sustainably harvested peat, or consider using long fiber sphagnum moss as a larger proportion of your mix. Some growers are experimenting with peat-free alternatives, though for carnivorous plants specifically, the acidity of sphagnum peat is difficult to replicate with other materials. One more thing that's endlessly fascinating. There's a species called the fanged pitcher plant that doesn't digest insects itself at all. It lets ants do the job. The ants live around the rim of the pitcher, feed on insects attracted to the trap, and defecate into the pitcher, transferring the nitrogen the plant needs. The plant has essentially outsourced its digestion. And here's a fact that puts the whole enterprise in perspective. Insects are a supplement, not a requirement. Carnivorous plants photosynthesize like any other plant and can survive without catching prey. A Venus flytrap can live for 3 weeks on a single large insect, but it doesn't need that insect to survive. It needs it to thrive. The bugs provide the nitrogen and phosphorus boost that allows the plant to grow faster, produce more leaves, and generate more traps. On a windowsill, your mini bog will catch the occasional fungus gnat or fruit fly all on its own. You don't need to hand feed it, though you absolutely can drop a small insect into a pitcher if you want to watch the magic happen. So let's bring this full circle. What you're building when you assemble a mini bog on your windowsill isn't just a planter. It's a functional replica of an ecosystem that began forming 12,000 years ago in the wake of retreating glaciers, housing plants whose evolutionary lineage stretches back 70 million years into the Cretaceous. You're using sphagnum moss that engineers its own acidity, growing plants that Charles Darwin found more fascinating than the origin of species itself, and doing it all by deliberately breaking the 3 most fundamental rules of container gardening: no drainage, no fertilizer, no tap water. If you want a house plant that just sits there looking green, get a pothos. But if you want something that catches its own food, makes Darwin's ghost proud, and gives you a legitimate reason to tell people you keep a prehistoric ecosystem on your windowsill, build a mini bog. It takes an afternoon, a plastic tub, some peat, and a jug of distilled water. The pitcher plants will take care of the rest. So tell me in the comments, are you brave enough to try building your own mini bog on your windowsill? If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, subscribe to Plant Care Secrets TV for more deep dives into the strange and wonderful world of plants, and consider becoming a member to support the channel and unlock exclusive perks. See you in the next one.